I will begin by describing these two pearls for biodiversity, which are the European Biodiversity Strategy for 2030 and the EU Nature Restoration Law. And these two pieces of legislation came in a very fertile context. The key element of it was the IPBES Global Assessment Report on biodiversity and ecosystem services, which was published in 2019. It really drew attention on the very serious deterioration of ecosystem services and biodiversity loss, on the fact that this deterioration was happening at a very fast pace, that only a transformative change could reverse this deterioration, meaning a change in the way we do business, our lifestyle, our governance. We really needed to change drastically how we did things. And that any progress could be made only with a sense of urgency and through a concerted effort of all the parties. And then it was also the time of Fridays for Future, when youth went to the streets and yelled that we all needed to protect the climate and the planet. And at the same time, the UN announced the decade on ecosystem restoration. And it was also the time of the EU Green Deal, of the farm to fork strategy, which is the sister strategy to the biodiversity strategy, the strategy on food, which is also another pearl I am not discussing today. And it was a pity that it was not fully reflected in the common agricultural policy. And then, of course, there was the pandemics and more recent, not the context where our two pieces of legislation were originated, but more recently, the war in the Ukraine. This creates the context for the biodiversity strategy and the nature restoration law, but also is a context where we see that there are two different visions. One that sees biodiversity as a pillar or the pillar, and one that sees ecological transition as business as usual, as an occasion to use technology and fix all the problems with technology, putting at the center economy, and forgetting the biodiversity is at the bottom of everything else. So these are the two pieces of legislation I will focus on today. The first one is soft policy. It is a strategy. It's not binding, even though the member states have made strong commitment in it. And the other one is a law, like a directive, like a regulation. It's hard policy. And they both put biodiversity in the center. So that's the vision that they reflect. The biodiversity strategy for 2030 is also called the Book of Wonders by some of the people working in NGOs in Brussels. It was presented in May 2020, approved in June 2021, and it was even improved compared to the draft. And it shows the EU as an ambitious leader on the global stage for biodiversity. The previous two strategies were not successful. They did not reach their intended results. They did not meet the targets, even though the targets were much lower than the ones that are set now in the new biodiversity strategy. And so the new strategy wanted to be different from the previous one, capitalize on the momentum in favor of biodiversity that was at the time. And it is a very bold, ambitious, measurable, and reader-friendly strategy. When you read the document, it's about 20 pages. It flows very well. It's not a hard text to read. It's very simple, very clear concepts. And this also makes it a very powerful tool. It is soft law, but it is supported by the EU nature restoration law, which is binding, which is not approved yet, but it's in the making. And so the two together make for a very good package. The strategy coordinates with other strategies related to biodiversity, including the climate strategy. It's in synergy with all the UN conventions related to the environment. It sets targets at the European level, continental level, and also at the national level. So each member state is responsible for reaching certain targets in their own country. And with this document, the European Commission really outdid itself. Yes, there was a lot of input from civil society, NGOs that wanted some contents included in this strategy, but the European Commission was really behind it. The European Commission was groundbreaking in this process. You will have this presentation. I have some links here. We are not opening them, but you can look at these videos later on. The European Commission also paid a lot of attention to how the strategy is being communicated. The goal of the strategy is that Europe's biodiversity will be on the path to recovery by 2030. Very simple goal. And this is for the benefit of people, the planet, the climate, and our economy. And it is in line with the two global agendas for sustainable development and for climate. Highlights for what needs to happen on the ground are protected areas and restoration. For protected areas, the strategy calls for a coherent network of protected areas. And here the first very good news is that the target is very high. The strategy calls for at least 30% of land and sea to be under protection, some sort of protection. And 1/3 of it needs to be under strict protection, especially focusing on primary and old growth forest. And these will be areas where industry or impactful infrastructures find no place. This means that existing protected areas have to be enlarged, and that new protected areas have to be established. And also that the Nature 2000 network needs to be completed. There are still gaps in it. But what is important is that the strategy says that the choice of the new protected areas has to be made based on scientific information, and that habitats need to be selected that are representative of biodiversity. So no rocky peaks, glaciers, high mountains that in part are already protected normally, but other types of habitats where protection is theoretically more difficult. protected areas have to include and be connected by ecological corridors. They have to be managed effectively, and there has to be cooperation across borders. Member states, according to the strategy, have to designate their areas to reach this protection target of 30% by the end of next year. There are the other component, the one on restoration, considers different sectors and different types of ecosystems use, and in particular calls for an ad hoc law with legally binding targets, which is the nature restoration law, which the Commission soon after the strategy began to prepare. It calls for fully implementing the environmental legislation, especially the directives that already exist, birds and habitat directives. So no further deterioration on the conservation status and trends of the habitats and species that are already protected by European legislation, and an improvement in the status of at least 30% of the species and the habitats that are currently defined as in non-favorable status. This is directive jargon. And then the strategy calls for bringing nature back to agricultural land. Agricultural land is enormous in the EU. If you bring nature back to agricultural land, you pretty much solve the biodiversity problem in Europe, almost. It's about reducing by 50% the use of chemical pesticides, reverse pollinators decline. At least 10% of the agricultural area has to be in highly diverse landscapes. 25% of the land under organic farming. Agroforestry has to be used, and genetic diversity has to stop declining. So these are very concrete targets for what regards the agricultural sector. And then the strategy calls for remediation of contaminated soil sites, more soil biodiversity, organic matter, better management, quantity, quality, and resilience of forests, and 3 billion trees, certain trees, those that are biodiversity friendly, to be planted in Europe by 2030, and the use of all types of forest making, afforestation, reforestation, proforestation. It calls for decarbonization and energy generation, not from any renewable energy source, but from sustainable renewable energy. It talks about biofuels, but puts the accent on advanced biofuels, those that can be produced from non-reusable and non-recyclable waste, much more than biofuels that come from agriculture. It focuses on marine ecosystems, on freshwater ecosystems, and here it has a very ambitious target of 25,000 kilometers of rivers that can flow freely, but it's not just the watercourse, but also the habitats related around the watercourse. It calls for greener urban and peri-urban areas, no use of pesticides in this area. It calls for reducing pollution, reduce the loss of nutrients, and therefore the need by 20% to use fertilizers, and it decreases by half the number of red list species that are threatened by invasive alien species. So it also addresses invasive alien species, making a strong stand on this because this is a controversial issue. I would like to move to the next slide, but I can't. There are two additional components in the strategy. One is the transformative change that was called for by IPBES, and the strategy addresses it by proposing changes in the governance and the monitoring system, in really stepping up implementation and enforcement of existing environmental legislation. And here again, it stresses Natura 2000, protecting habitat and species inside, but also outside the Natura 2000 sites. It calls for a stronger role of civil society. It recognizes that civil society is a watchdog for compliance, needs to continue doing so, and it aims at improving access to justice by individuals and NGOs. So indirectly, it also calls for more transparency in how the strategy is implemented. It includes businesses, of course, the private sector, and it focuses also on knowledge through research, through better monitoring of where we're going in the progress towards the targets, and on education for environmental sustainability in all school cycles, from elementary school to university level. And then you as a leader, a global leader on biodiversity. This is stated in the strategy. The EU wants to be seen as a leader, and it pushed for a post-2020 global biodiversity framework that was as ambitious as possible. And it also is undertaking a lot of other actions beyond its borders on oceans, trade, One Health concept, human rights, etc. I'm getting a message that my connection is not stable. Do you hear me? Okay. I'm trying to go fast, so there will be time at the end for some questions. The strategy also sets the ground for implementation by allocating a staggering budget. You see here the figure. And also by stating that enough appropriate competent staff will have to be acquired in the European Commission and the European Environmental Agency to accompany the implementation of the strategy. Meanwhile, member states should have made their pledges already at the end of last year of how they intend to achieve the targets, the ones at European level, but also the ones at their national level. But very few countries have already submitted their pledges. My country, for example, Italy, has not even begun. So here is already a sign that implementation is not fully in line with the expected timeline. But there are also some good progress, which is that the biodiversity strategy is becoming a guidance for other processes that have incorporated it. For example, the Alpine Convention has a new multi-annual program to 2030, and biodiversity is one of the 3 pillars, and the biodiversity strategy is explicitly mentioned in the document. And the Alpine Biodiversity Board also refers to the biodiversity strategy in its new mandate for the next 2 years. At the same time, the European Biodiversity Partnership, Biodiversa Plus, which is the next generation after Biodiversa in previous years, was launched. This is mentioned in the strategy as a partnership at European level, a partnership between member states for the implementation of the strategy, and this was launched. And by the way, CIPRA International participates in Biodiversa Plus, is a member of the Extended Stakeholders Board. But member states need to reach these targets. Whether or not they have made their pledges yet, they will soon, especially when the restoration law is approved, have to move along quickly towards the targets. So NGOs are already discussing with the European Commission how we can push the member states to become active without waiting too long. And they have already identified that gap analysis already exists, for example, of where protected areas are missing, and new protected areas should be created to fill these gaps. They don't need to do any new intensive research to localize new protected areas. Countries need to be ambitious and think large when they plan how to reach the targets. It's not about creating 100 small new protected sites, but rather about identifying a large landscape where they can act and make a difference. So an entire river basin, a cross-boundary landscape, something significant. And then they can already start grounding the objectives of the strategy on the local level by interacting with that level of jurisdiction and involving local actors, not necessarily at the authority, in the authority sector, but also other stakeholders. So there is space for all of us to step in and bring the message of the biodiversity strategy in our fora, in our circles, where everything is spelled out and easy to find what needs to be done. So the strategy has an annex, 4 pages of commitments that the Commission has taken in the strategy. And one of these commitments is to develop a binding instrument for these biodiversity targets. And this is the EU Nature Restoration Law, which is now in the making, and which is another book of wonders, because it is as bold, as far-reaching, as clear, reader-friendly as the biodiversity strategy. And it gives teeth to the strategy. This is hard law, and it addresses the worrisome factor that by the European Commission own estimates, 81% of the continental habitats is in poor conditions. The timeline for this law is we're almost in time, not quite, but almost. The draft was proposed by the EC in June. Now there are amendments being introduced to the draft by the committees in the Parliament that deal with these issues, and where member states participate with their delegates. At the end of this round of amendments, the draft law could be weakened or could be strengthened, as happened for the biodiversity strategy. But after it, if the content is not twisted compared to the original intentions of the Commission, in which case the Commission can decide to withdraw the law if it has become something completely different. If the content is in line with the original intention, it goes to vote, and it can either be approved or rejected by the European Parliament and the European Council. We hope that this will happen in 2023, that we have the law by next year. And once the law is approved, we have a law which has the goal to restore ecosystems, habitats, and species across the EU's land and sea, with the objective to enable the long-term and sustained recovery of biodiverse and resilient nature, but also contribute to achieving the climate objectives for mitigation and adaptations of the EU. So there is a very strong link, and it is explicitly stated before these biodiversity policies and climate. It has also been estimated by the Commission that for every euro invested in restoring nature, there are benefits that range between 8 and 38 euros. So this is an economic argument that needs no further explanations. Highlights of this law are the targets. The targets that were anticipated in the strategy are now put in writing in the law. They become binding, and beyond the targets, there are other obligations for the member states and for other European bodies. So this is where it becomes hard law. These targets and obligations refer to pollinating insects, forest ecosystems, urban ecosystems, agricultural ecosystem, rivers, marine ecosystems, what we mentioned earlier for the biodiversity strategy. In some cases, the same targets are confirmed and put in writing. In other cases, additional targets, more precise targets, precise deadlines are given, so that the law really provides a binding, very clear framework where nobody can say, oh, I didn't know how to interpret, it was not clear by when. Everything is very clear. The law's articles are organized by ecosystem type. What I'd like to draw your attention on is the hard law jargon. So here it says member states shall put in place. Everything is shall. Shall is a very powerful legal term. So it's not we recommend, we encourage, but it's member states shall. They have an obligation. And you can see here, this is just an example. There are 10 such examples in the law. Which target has to be reached by when? And normally targets improve every 10 years. So it's not like you've reached a target by 2030 and you are done. You have to continue keeping the favorable trend for the decades to come. A very interesting aspect of the law is that it sets the type of indicator and sometimes the specific indicator that needs to be used to measure progress towards the target. And what I particularly like is that they mention indexes. For example, the butterfly index or the common farmland bird index. These are indexes that have been used in Europe for many years 20 plus years. So we have long data series. And so we're not starting from scratch. We already have a baseline. We already have a trend, which, by the way, these indexes show as being negative trend. And these are also indexes. They are not just single indicators. So they are essential biodiversity variables. They are called like that. They do not only describe the status of a species, but the status of a habitat. And this is very, very important. And then the law sets the obligations for national restoration plans that each member state needs to develop, the content of these plans. And what is interesting here is that countries have to interact with one another. In our case, in the Alps, it means that alpine countries need to interact over cross-boundary landscapes of rivers. And this is not just a suggestion, something auspicable, but it is an obligation. And then there is an article on access to justice, which I mentioned earlier. Members of the public, and elsewhere is also NGOs, have to have it easy if they want to access a review procedure. If they're not convinced that what has been done is according to the law, the restoration law. So everything points to transparency and the role of civil society. After the law is approved, it will become legally binding. Never before have we had such an ambitious law with such clear targets, so many targets all together. This is why it is a book of wonders. It's a very courageous, groundbreaking piece of legislation. The EU member states will have to comply with the obligations set in the law, prepare and submit their national restoration plans within 2 years, and monitor their progress towards their national restoration plans. The Environmental Agency of Europe will have a reporting and monitoring assessment role, and the EC will regularly update the Parliament and the Council. We hope that it will be approved and enter into force next year. This is not a given, but civil society is ready to mount a campaign to put pressure on the relevant actors for this to happen. We really would not want this law to come into force in 2 or 3 years from now, because we would lose some of the important momentum which has been created so far. So what is the future ahead of us? What are we to expect? And what is realistic to say at this point? The EU has a great record of good legislation. They have a good review process to determine whether the legislation is fit for purpose, to amend the legislation, public consultations. Where the EU is weaker is implementation, but implementation is crucial. So we now have two, I sort of take it for granted that the restoration law will be approved. We have 2 good pieces of legislation. We have to focus on their implementation. I would like to stress also the fact that often strategies are underestimated because they're not binding, because they're soft law. But when strategies are good strategies and they work in parallel with good law, they can be very powerful. So it is worth our time to invest in pushing the biodiversity strategy. The EC has been bold in drafting these documents and seeing them approved. Let us not leave the European Commission alone. Let's keep supporting the Commission. Biodiversity has taken a better path in the EC procedures, better than agriculture. Let's stand behind the Commission so that the biodiversity policies are not watered down, as unfortunately happened with some aspects of the common agricultural policy. We can be champions of the biodiversity strategy and the nature restoration law in our own circles, as I said earlier. Let us never get tired of bringing it to the table when we are talking to stakeholders, decision makers, policy makers at all levels, a mayor, a councillor in a community, a regional councillor, at all levels. Many people don't know that these pieces of legislation exist, and they already spell out 199 possible actions to be taken. So they don't need to create consultation processes at local level, brainstorming on what needs to be done. They have a list, they can take what fits their local context and start implementing. But often they don't know. So we can be spokesperson for these pearls of biodiversity. Next month in Canada, there will be the 15th Conference of the Parties of the Convention on Biological Diversity, and the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework will be approved. This is also an important policy item for biodiversity. The EU, which is a signatory of the convention, has pushed a lot for a good framework. So the speed and the effort on the nature restoration law could be increased after the approval of the Global Biodiversity Framework. So let's stay tuned, because we may receive an input to become active sooner than we expect. And I would like to conclude by mentioning the war in the Ukraine again, and the implications this is having on at least two sectors, the energy and the food sector, and the sense of urgency that is being conveyed is already showing that some decisions are made very quickly without thinking of the consequences. We have examples of countries that are deregulating environmental laws to move quickly towards energy production from renewable sources, which is not necessarily sustainable. Or we have heard that the war will cause hunger, even in Europe. So we don't need to meet the targets for reducing pesticides, increasing organic agriculture that are set in the biodiversity strategy, because we need more food or Europeans will be hungry. But this narrative doesn't really reflect reality, because we know that, unfortunately for them, hunger is coming to other continents, not to us. So this narrative is a bit manipulating the consequences of the war and away from the targets of the strategy. But this will not really address the urgency of the issue. So my conclusion is an encouragement to use the spaces for participation and influence that we find. Let's make sure to be heard, and we are not left alone in this role of doing our part, because the European Commission also offers two important tools. The first one is the Have Your Say platform. You can register to this platform and receive alerts when something of the European legislation body comes for consultation, and you can provide your opinion on that piece of legislation. But you can also make proposals to the European Commission on something which is not up for review, for example, in that particular moment, using the second platform, where you can send suggestions on how the European legislation body can be simplified, what you would change and why. And with this, I conclude what I had to say.